They're doing
knocks
well.
him for a loop.
Yeah, I know.
You are here, I was looking
Yeah.
for you.
It's already done, thank you.
The white streak. He's here, he's there, he's everywhere.
Church down here, I think he's gotta teach new member class.
Okay.
All right.
I'm gonna sit.
Okay, sure.
More handouts on the table.
Yeah. I wonder if we should put a waiver out there so people.
Oh, the sign on the door.
It's the first time I've did anything in this room.
How you doing?
Good, how about you?
All right. Hectic morning. Figure out how to make all this work.
How'd the teams do yesterday?
Basketball?
Yeah.
Well, we're not on that yet, but, because it's 7th, 8th grade.
Oh, in varsity, okay.
Yeah, so,
That's right.
but I watched one of the boys' games online for like 5 minutes and they were losing pretty big. And I know the girls were playing the best team in the state. And they played them last year and absolutely smoked mine. So I'm assuming that didn't go well, but I didn't see any of it. But just the fact that they made it is good. It's impressive.
So it's the top 8 Lutheran schools in the
It's
state?
the top 8 in the state, yeah. So
Wow.
both the boys and girls made it, so yeah, it's good. All right, well, looks like everybody found us. Good night, everybody.
Good morning. You brought your goodies. For 2 weeks. You brought your treats. Yeah, that's right.
Well, I just haven't fully tested the audio, but I got the audio jack plugged in, so. Well, it's, no, I only have HDMI on my laptop, so I
By the
went
time
and bought
you
a
sit here.
VGA. But it has an aux plug in it. That in theory is connected into that thing, which is in theory hooked up, but I didn't test it.
We'll know soon enough.
Yeah, right. Hopefully we're not listening to audio through my laptop. I did put it up to the speaker just in case. All right. Well, thank you for making it, finding your way down here. We're gonna be here today and then I think next week also. And then, so I've got material for today and next week. And after that, I'm gonna be missing a week. And so I guess we can decide next week if there's something else that we want to cover and maybe have another week or something after I get back. And the schedule's on the top of the sheet there. If not, it'll be today and tomorrow and then, or tomorrow, today and next week, and we'll wrap up then. But again, if there's something that I don't cover in the next 2 weeks that people are really interested in, then maybe we can have another session covering miscellaneous topics that maybe I didn't get to. So yeah, I got the laptop over here. I think everything's gonna work properly. I had to try to figure it out this morning. So hopefully we don't run into any technical glitches as we go through. So far so good. I am just gonna have to walk back and forth to click things up. So today we're gonna get into, we started getting into the science side of this discussion. We started the first couple weeks looking through the Bible and what does the Bible say about our presuppositions and our worldview. The last 2 weeks we were watching some videos that had to do with the geological record, the age of the earth, the flood, fossils. And today we're going to get into the scientific method. And we're going to look at what the scientific method says and try to apply that to this discussion of evolution and see how that applies and where science, where we land with that in this whole discussion.
Yeah, was it mostly just a video I missed from the last session?
There was, yeah, half of it was the video, the other half was, it was discussions of, for those, half of it was the video, the other half was other discussion, yeah.
I can catch the
Exactly.
YouTube version then.
Pardon me?
I can catch the YouTube version.
Yes, it should all be out there on at the YouTube link on the top
I
of the page.
haven't tried that.
Yep, but, yeah, I think we've been able to record every one of them so far, thankfully.
Thanks.
So, like I said, we're going to start off with science. And I know when we started this class, we had started with, a lot of what we hear in media and in the schools is that evolution is a proven fact. people, the scientific community especially, doesn't dispute evolution. And therefore, us as Christians, why do we dispute it? You know, we're kind of the outliers in all of this. But the reality is that's not true. There's actually a website here. I've got it printed here, and it's on your sheet as well. It's called Descent from Darwin. And they make this statement here. We are skeptical of claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life. Careful examination of the evidence of Darwinian theory should be encouraged. This is a very general statement, and they purposefully word it that way. It makes no mention of creation, no mention of God. It's not meant as a religious statement, but it's meant to garner support from scientists that do question the theory of evolution, and they question it for scientific reasons. I think I mentioned this last week a little bit, that this was out there. So in 2001, there were about 100 scientists who had signed it. In 2005, it had gone up to 500, and today it's past the 1,000 scientist mark. I'll pass this around as just a printout of all the scientists who have signed it, and there are some pretty impressive credentials on there. And again, this doesn't mean that they believe in creation, doesn't mean that they're Christians, doesn't mean they believe in a young earth, but what it means is they've seen enough in scientific evidence that makes them question whether evolution can actually cause the diversity of life that we see today. Can you go from single-celled organisms up to us through Darwinian evolution? And these scientists would say you cannot for various reasons. And some of those reasons we're going to get into over the next couple of weeks. So I'm going to start with what I think is a funny video. Have you guys ever heard of Lutheran satire? It's a couple of guys who create videos of these two Irish guys. You know, they'll see as they start talking. And they try to teach you Lutheran doctrine, the Lutheran faith, through funny videos like this. This one happens to be about science and a little bit about evolution. And I guess we'll see if you find it as funny as I do. And hopefully this works, because so far so good. Might have to watch an advertisement again. Uh-oh, audio. Oh no, I was afraid of this. Alright, so let's skip the ad. And let's figure out how to get audio.
You're not seeing the screen well.
Oh, you're not seeing it? Oh, you're not, okay, I gotta get out of presentation mode. Are we now? Nope. Well, I hope we don't have to, okay, no.
Can you just duplicate the screen, or that's what you're?
That's what I'm attempting, yeah. I'm attempting just to get out of presentation mode and. Alright, now we can see them, right?
Yeah, you might need to adjust that cable again. It's pink.
Yeah.
Oh, boy. And it's playing, but we have no audio. Oh. There's a bunch of
Is that depiction of Uncle Martin there?
No, that's Richard Dawkins. He's a.
Oh, he goes.
I know what the problem is. I don't want
Oh,
to
you
blare
do?
it all out.
Okay.
I think I know what the problem is. All right. Well, we'll listen to it through the laptop.
Okay, Patrick, tell us a bit more about this atheism thing. Yeah, Patrick, tell us.
Certainly, yes. Well, you see, in ancient times, people like you invented stories about various gods creating the earth and mankind because you lacked the scientific knowledge necessary to understand the origins of the universe. But in my day, thanks to scientific progress, we do understand these things, and so it's no longer necessary for us to fool ourselves into thinking that some silly god created us.
But what about all that stuff that defies scientific explanation? Isn't that evidence of God's existence? Yeah, riddle us that, Patrick.
Stuff like what?
Well, how about the multitude of miracles in the Bible, chief among them the resurrection of our Lord Jesus?
Oh, you sweet little simpletons. People don't rise from the dead.
Except for that one time Jesus rose from the dead. Yeah, that was awesome.
No, what I'm saying is that Jesus never rose from the dead.
And how do you know that, Patrick?
Because it's not possible for people to rise from the dead.
Yeah, we know. That's why it was sort of a big deal when Jesus rose from the dead.
Look, I think you're far too uneducated to understand this, but if people could rise from the dead, then people would rise from the dead. If Jesus could rise from the dead, surely someone else would have risen from the dead as well.
Other people have risen from the dead.
Like who?
Like all the people in the Bible who rose from the dead because Jesus rose them from the dead not long before he himself rose from the dead.
Well, obviously you can't count those examples.
Why not, Patrick?
Because they come from the Bible, and the Bible is a ridiculous book full of silly stories that couldn't possibly happen, like...
People rising from the dead?
Exactly.
Right. So according to you, the resurrection doesn't prove the existence of God because it never happened. And we know it never happened because we know that people can't rise from the dead. And we know that people can't rise from the dead because no one ever has risen from the dead if you don't count all the people who have risen from the dead. I think I'm onto your little trick here, Patrick. Yeah, you're a sneaky little secularist, Patrick. So your strategy for proving the non-existence of God is to systematically rule out every piece of evidence for the existence of God solely because that evidence could be used to prove the existence of God. What a perfectly reasonable use of the scientific method, Patrick. Yeah, we'd love to see you employ this strategy in the laboratory, Patrick. Hey, Conwell, I just proved that there's no such thing as barium. And how'd you do that, Donald? By throwing out all the samples of barium. I'm surprised more defense attorneys don't attempt this in the courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I have conclusively proven to you that my client is innocent, as long as you ignore the murder weapon, his confession, and the 400 witnesses who saw him stab that guy in the face.
Look, clearly you're not enlightened enough to understand.
I mean, really, Patrick. By your logic, the first president of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod could prove himself to be the best-looking man in the world. All he'd have to do is lock every other male on the planet in his dressing room right before the beauty pageant begins.
Oh, no, even then I would still lose.
So I may not be a scientist, Patrick. I may not possess your superior intellect and education. I may even be a superstitious Neanderthal who thinks that thunder is what happens when God yells at leprechauns. I think it's the result of a shockwave in the air due to the sudden thermal expansion of plasma in the lightning channel, but that's because I'm stupid. Nonetheless, I still know a lame argument when I hear one. And when you accuse Christians of remaining in ignorance because they refuse to allow any evidence to challenge their theistic worldview, only to dismiss every eyewitness account of our Lord's resurrection solely because it challenges your atheistic worldview, well, that's not just lame. It's also a wee bit of the clover calling the grass green. That's an adorable Celtic twist on a classic idiom, Patrick.
Don't be absurd. I treat the Bible exactly the way I treat everything else. I'm a man of reason and evidence and facts. I'm a man of science, a world-renowned evolutionary biologist. I defy you to give me one example of something that I believe in despite no scientist ever having seen it happen.
Evolution.
Dang it. But really, have you actually read your holy book? Your God is a heartless, hateful, murderous ogre. There's no reason to believe in such a vile deity.
I'm sorry, Patrick. I'm going to need a second to recover from that. Yeah, Patrick, stop in the name of logic before you break my brain. Placing your failure to properly understand the justice of the Almighty aside for a moment, did you honestly just argue that God doesn't exist because he's mean? Why, if being a jerk made you cease to exist, then every war in human history would have been over the second it started. Rosie O'Donnell would have disappeared in a puff of smoke in 1998 instead of getting fired from The View once every 7 minutes. And that jerk who makes those Lutheran satire videos wouldn't even be able to finish recording.
All right, so we're not here trying to prove the existence of God. This was mostly just make sure this comes back up. Hey, and we got proper color back again. All right, I don't know. It's just meant to show how people approaching a topic from two different worldviews, right? The British guy was meant to be Richard Dawkins. He's an evolutionist and an atheist. So he's approaching it from an atheistic standpoint where there is no supernatural, and so he looks at things in a way that you can't have the supernatural. Miracles can't happen because there's no supernatural to make them happen. And the Irish guys were obviously from a Christian background, and so of course miracles can happen. God can make them happen. And so it's a way of looking at data, and they talked about the scientific method, and the Irish guys were talking about how Richard Dawkins wasn't applying the scientific method. So what we want to look at today is the scientific method. And but when we talk about science, we immediately say, well, if we're talking about science, then we can prove things. And that's true if you're following the scientific method as it's written. There are some things, and we'll get into this, there are some things that science can't tell us. But what is the scientific method? So there's really 5 steps. I mean, there's different variations of this, but in essence, you're looking at 5 steps that you follow when you're talking about doing science. What are you trying to do? So you have the formulation of a question. So what are you trying to determine? You then you consider a hypothesis. So you develop a conjecture based on the knowledge obtained while formulating the question. And we'll do a very, very easy example after this. You make a prediction based on what you think could happen based on your hypothesis. Then you create a set of experiments or some way to test your prediction. And then you take the data from your test, you analyze it, and then you come up with some results. And then scientists might publish those results and say, hey, here's what I found. Other scientists will go through, try to duplicate those results. And then over time, as things become duplicated and people can observe things, then people would say, okay, we have proven this scientifically. And I think the key to this is that it's testable and it's repeatable and it's observable, right? There is something to be said about, and you get into this in the evolutionary argument, that, well, you can't necessarily test and observe it all, but there is enough other data or evidence, people would say, about it, and there's a consensus view on it in the community that, well, it's true. But I think that's when you have to be very careful about science, when people start saying that there's a consensus view on something. Every scientific theory that has happened through history has at one point or another had a consensus view. Hence, it was the leading scientific theory or the scientific, belief. But then a lot of those things get overturned over time. For instance, we've talked about the Galileo incident and the Earth being the center of the solar system, or the Sun being the center of the solar system. So for a long time, there was the belief that the Earth was the center of the solar system. Science came around, and there was, the majority of people believed that was true, but there were these 1%ers that were dissenting, and who knows what the percent was. But right, there was this few people who dissented that view, and over time, they were right. So you can't just say because there's a consensus and 99% of people believe something is true, that it is 100% absolutely true. And we as Christians have to be careful of this, especially when something contradicts what we might read in the Bible. And this comes back to what we've talked about before, where we have the 2 different revelations, right? We have the special revelation of the Bible, and we have the natural revelation of the created order, and they both must match. And if there's something that differs between them, or we find some contradiction between them, it's not a contradiction in what God has done. He's created both revelations. It's a contradiction in how we are viewing one or the other. So even in a scientific method, we can have some bias, though. You can understand how you can formulate a question that is biased in a certain way. So like as Christians, we might say, a question of, I'm going to prove that the world's only 6,000 years old, right? We've immediately put bias into the question, or conversely, an evolutionist might say, I'm going to put millions of years. I'm going to prove that it's millions of years, right? So there's bias in the question. So saying that science is a neutral field of study is also not completely true. Although by the time you get down to the bottom, if you can repeat and observe, some of the bias you're going to weed out. But your initial question leads to some level of bias, or could have some level of bias in it, based on your presuppositions or your worldview. So just a very easy example. The question, can we change characteristics of a dog? All right, we just want to know, can I make this dog look like some other dog or have different characteristics? And your hypothesis is, I think we can, by breeding dogs that have the characteristics that I'm looking for. So my prediction is I want to have a long-haired dog. I think if I breed long-haired dogs together, I'm going to get long-haired dogs. And so you can test it by breeding your dogs
after however many times you breed or whatever, you can look at the results and you say, okay, yes, I see how I can get long-haired dogs from breeding long-haired dogs together. We're going to talk, I'm going to walk through a very basic example of this when we get into, I'm going to talk about natural selection coming up. But it's just an example of how you might set up the scientific method to try to determine something. So I talked about this a little bit before. Science doesn't always get things right. That doesn't mean there's a problem in science. It could just be the information we have available to us, the knowledge we have available at the time. People used to think the Earth was flat. Most people don't think that anymore, although there's still some people out there that do. I talked about the Earth being the center of the solar system. At one point, we didn't know cells existed, then we developed microscopes. Then we knew that there were cells. Then we thought the cell was the smallest thing, then developed electron microscopes, and we could look inside the cell, and there's even smaller things in there. But this doesn't mean the prior information was wrong, it just means we didn't know everything at the time when the first scientific explanation was created, and then we learned more, and we learned more, and we developed better tools, and we can see smaller, we can see bigger, and again, we're refining the scientific process. It's not saying, again, I want to be clear, this is not an anti-science discussion, right? I firmly believe in science. Science does wonderful things for us. Science creates the computers we use, the cell phones we use, the modern medicine that we have that keeps us alive longer than we've ever lived before, right? That's all from science. But it's all from provable, testable, observable, repeatable science and that's how we know it works, right? We see it day in and day out. And I think that's where we have to be very careful of, is drawing the line from, hey, I can see that science is true, or people call this science, but has it really been proven through a rigorous method? Any questions on that so far? So, as I mentioned, science does have limits. Science is not real good at answering questions about the past. One, we weren't there to observe it, and two, we can't repeat it, right? So we can't really run things about the past through a scientific method and repeat it. Although that doesn't mean science can't tell us anything about the past. Certainly we have fields of archaeology and paleontology and other that looks at the past, uses other scientific methods to say, okay, when I see this in the Earth, what does it mean? I can draw conclusions. But again, this is where someone's presuppositions coming into that could drive the end results that they see out of the data that they get. Everyone looking at the past has the same data, right? We have the same data we're looking at, but people could draw different conclusions. And it's hard to prove, in many instances, what's 100% correct, because we can't repeat it. We can't observe what was there. And so we just have to be careful how we look at that data. Science can't prove morality. Morality is out there, but science can't prove it. Science cannot define beauty. Just some other things. There's a thought out there by a lot of scientists that I should be able to prove everything through science. Well, science isn't going to be able to prove everything. And as I've been arguing, and I'll continue to argue, I don't think science can prove evolution. And the list of scientists we showed at the beginning of the class, there's a whole 1,000 other scientists who also feel that, at least from a Darwinian evolution standpoint, it has not been proven. And Darwinian evolution is the leading theory on what's causing it. Yes, Mark?
Just an oddball curiosity question. Beauty, that's an interesting inclusion on that list, because it is repeatable, it is observable. I was just curious, why did that get a bullet point?
I don't think you can really prove it through a scientific method. It is observable, but I think beauty is very person dependent, how you see beauty. So you could, and again, your presuppositions are going to come in and play into it as to what I find beautiful and what another person finds beautiful would be different.
Yeah, but I don't think that's inherently outside of the limits of science. I think you could decide that.
So I think you could certainly define certain things that most people would find as being
more pleasing to the eye than not. You know, I know I've read like people's eyes, the distance between their eyes, how they're shaped, right? There's a standard for what people would find as, hey, I think that's better looking than this, but I think in general, beauty, and the only point I'm making is I think beauty is more of a personal, in the end, it's more of a personal view than I can just scientifically prove something is beautiful, just because of personal preference. That's really the only point I'm making there. If it's a bad example, then.
Personal preference, that would be, yeah, I just thought that was a curious choice for the list, because that, I would say that definitely falls within the realm of
Okay.
science. It will be different for different people, no doubt. But I think.
Well, I think that's the distinction I'm making. I think as soon as you can say it's going to be different for different people, you start stepping outside of the bounds of the scientific method. And I think that's where we start getting into problems on what we call science a lot.
Well, as long as there were a consistent set of rules that underpinned it, even if it came up with different results for different people, I think, I think science can approach that.
I think science can approach it, but it can't find the objective truth in it. I think that's where the issue is. So like you have people like classical architecture and people like modern or contemporary architecture. They each would call that beautiful and probably call the other one not attractive, you know, and so there's no objective truth there where to some of these others. I think that's the differentiation.
Yeah, that's
Surely science can study the aspects of what makes, like symmetry makes that architecture beautiful, right? Or certain lines make it pleasing to the eye. You could study why that would be appealing to someone, but it definitely won't get you to a point of saying this is objective beauty. It would be, this is more beautiful than this.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily about objectivity, but if you could describe basically a system that underpins how people come up with beauty, which I think you probably could, then it would be.
But again, it's just a system that you're applying certain constraints to. It's not an objective truth. That's the difference, I would say. But I would agree that it probably didn't need to be here.
I kind of disagree with that. I think the goal that I think we're all looking at science and the scientific method is getting to fact. I don't care for science trying to demonstrate to me that a certain population of people think something is true. I can go interview people to find that out. I want to know what fact is.
And that's kind of where I'm going with this. And I think the way you put it is objective truth, right? All of these have, although we would argue that there's objective truth and morality from the Bible, but people who don't believe the Bible would say, well, that's not true. I don't have to follow that morality. And I think the same is true of beauty. I think it comes back to this. The best science can do is weed out unlikely scenarios. So I think everybody, when we talk about morality, I think everybody would understand that mass murder is wrong. No matter what culture you come from, people would tend to agree that mass murder is wrong. Even those cultures that have done it would probably say that, hey, that is wrong. Right?
But even that is one aspect of morality. You can look at morality of what existed 50 years ago as commonly accepted morality that is vastly different now.
That's right. And so right, agreed. I think objective truth is, I think that's a good way to look at it, I think, Bill, is what is objective truth? When we start talking about the age of the universe, we can't get to 100% fact, right? We can certainly do some things with science, but I've looked at the arguments from those who say the universe is millions of years old, and I've looked at the arguments from those who say it's thousands of years old. I think from a scientific standpoint, they will both defend their position very well scientifically. If anybody went and watched that debate that I had put in the last notes, you will see both of those scientists defended their point of view well, and it really came down to their presuppositions and their worldview as to how they're viewing the data that they're looking at. So that's just the point I'm trying, and I think this plays into the evolution debate. So we talk about there being a bias in how you can set up the scientific method. Is the universe billions of years or thousands of years old? Your initial question can be biased, but when we look at, okay, we can't necessarily know 100% the age of the universe because we weren't there and we can't test it in some way. But we can use science to show us, what can science tell us about this, though? And one of the things we've talked about is uniformitarian assumptions, which most evolutionists would base the age of the universe on uniformitarian assumptions, which just says the processes I see today are how the processes have always been. And they use that assumption for, and I have the next slide's on radiometric dating, but they use those assumptions to date things. But if those assumptions are true, then every uniformitarian method of dating something should give us, if the science behind it is correct, and if the initial assumptions are correct, every uniformitarian dating method should give us roughly the same date. Okay, there might be some margin of error, but it should give us roughly the same date. Now, evolutionists would say the universe is, the Earth is roughly 4.5 billion years old. And I pulled this table out of a book that looked at 40-some, do the math, maybe closer to 60-some different uniformitarian dating methods. And I've listed a couple ways that things can be dated down here. But when you look at it, 23 of those methods came out with under 10,000 years. You can see the progression. None of them had dates in the 4.5 billion years. And none of them even had anything over 1 million years. And they all are wildly different. So if uniformitarian assumptions are accurate, I would expect these all to be in the 4.5-ish billion years, roughly, and give us a closer age. So this immediately tells me that maybe something's wrong with the assumptions.
You're including tree rings in this?
Well, tree rings is a method of uniformitarian dating,
But
as are ice cores.
certainly you wouldn't say because there's no trees that are billions
No.
of years old. I mean, that's pretty silly.
But when the tree rings are listed, they will date these hundreds of thousands of years, though, and not billions, because yes, I would agree, you're not going to have a billion-year-old tree. Right? But they will date trees hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years based on the tree rings. And what they do is they count every ring and say one ring is.
You mean series of trees?
It could be a.
Are you talking fossilized trees?
Yeah. Well.
I guess I'm not sure, because, I mean, I know you get the thousands of years of tree rings, but I've never heard of hundreds of thousands.
So they. Well.
Because trees just don't live that long. I mean.
Agreed.
But neither do
neither
do animals.
It's a good, and they may be from fossilized trees that I've read the number before. It could be more. I'd have to go back and look clearly. But again, ice cores is another one. What they do when they count these, and again, they come up with ages much longer than you would expect when they count these than a young Earth would seem. And what they do is each ring they view as 1 year, right? Every growth ring is a year in the growth of that tree, or in the layer of snow that's been created in the ice cores. But what they've noticed is, and so based on that, they get longer time frames, certainly not billions of years, and I'll have to double check Mark on the hundred thousands of years, but they certainly get longer time frames than what we would view as the young Earth in the thousands of years. But what a creation scientist would argue is that as the tree is older, it's harder to see the rings, and as the snow compacts more, the levels compact even further, and it's hard to, one, differentiate each layer, but two, they've been able to measure that a single season for a tree, depending upon how the drought cycle of the year, the amount of rain it gets in the year, you can actually have multiple rings in a given year. And even in the snowfall, if you get a snowfall and a heavy compaction, and you get more snowfall, you can get multiple layers in the ice cores in a single year, which may make it look like it's older than it would really be. We saw these two examples in the video about the amount of salt in the oceans, and if the assumptions were true, the uniformitarian assumptions were true,
then you'd have, an age in the millions, not in the billions, and same with the depths of the sediments in the ocean. Another one is the distance of the moon from the Earth. The moon moves away from the Earth every year by about 1.5 inch, and if you back that up, the moon would have collided with the Earth at about the 1.5 billion year mark, so much sooner than the 4.5 billion. And even before that, the moon would have been pulled apart by the Earth's gravity. So again, but if the Earth is only 6,000 years old, then the moon would have only progressed away from the Earth by 700 and some feet, which is reasonable. And then another one is blue stars. Blue stars are a star with less energy. They burn out, according to scientists, in like 10 million years. So if the universe is billions of years old, you would expect the blue stars to have burned out. But then people would argue, well, new stars are being constantly made. But from what astronomers are viewing, they don't see new stars being made. They see like the starts of stars being made, but they actually don't see them where they're coming into existence anymore. It's not something that's observable. So they don't really know new stars are coming into existence, but yet we still have blue stars, but in a billion-year-ish galaxy, all the blue stars should have burned out by now. So again, not proof of anything, but just as you start looking at all these different assumptions of what drives the way people date things, then it calls into question, well, how do we get to 4.5 billion years?
So Jeff, if I could, just a lot of those methods, I'd be curious to see the work cited on some of that stuff. But to me, that sounds like it's ripe for some Lutheran sarcasm. No, what was it?
Satire.
Thank you. That's like saying because it's not raining right now, or a rainstorm only lasts on average an hour, and it's not raining right now, it's never going to rain again. I mean, that seems like really strange logic there.
But we know rain happens periodically.
That just means stars are continuing to burn out, which we know they are. So you would expect to always see blue stars as long as the universe is old enough for stars to be burning out.
Well, that's the point, right? Based on uniformitarian assumptions, and the universe being 14 billion years old, all the blue stars should have burned out.
No, that's assuming no new stars are burning out.
Right, but what I mentioned was they don't see new stars being formed.
Yeah, actually, this is a big news story. I think in the past year and a half, we see stars collapse all the time. They're continuing to burn out.
Well, collapse.
Collapse. I'm talking about new ones forming.
Reform, that's the.
Well,
And-
there's also plenty of evidence for that. But just as far as a blue star, this is a star in decline. Yes.
A blue star is a star with
As long as stars
less
continue to
energy.
burn out.
It just has less energy because it's the color of it. They know it's got less energy, and it'll burn out sooner. Is
Yeah.
what they
So
are.
the fact that you can observe blue stars just means that stars are continuing to lose energy, which I think is pretty consistent with everyone's view of the universe.
If the universe is billions of years old, this is the argument I'm attempting to make. If the universe is billions of years old, and blue stars at the most can survive for about 10 million years based on their energy level, and if no new stars are being created right now, which is from what I've read, if you have other data, let me know. From what I've read, we don't see new stars being formed right now. And if that's the case, and if we still have blue stars, the only argument is then the universe can't be 14 billion years old. Doesn't say how old it really is.
Okay, but that's not a logical conclusion. So even if let's just agree for the moment that stars aren't being created, even though I don't think that's true, but not an astronomer, don't have the evidence ready to flip. But you're just saying if there shouldn't be any blue stars, you're just saying stars aren't burning out anymore. That's a very different. You see the distinction?
No.
He's saying over 14 billion years,
They-
all the stars would have been.
Those blue stars
So
should
let's
have
say
burned
you
out.
started off with 100% of stars, and let's say they're burning out at different rates, which they are. Then you would continue to expect to see blue stars, no matter how long, no matter how old the Earth is.
Until all the stars at point zero are gone. What he's saying is, if over 14 billion years, no new stars were being created, eventually all the ones at point zero would be gone, because there's nothing filling it, backfilling them.
Yeah, but of course, all the stars aren't gone, but the point you're making is that there shouldn't be any blue stars, which are stars that are
Specifically
in
blue
the
stars.
process of losing energy.
Well, no, all star, well, I mean, it depends on the life of the star, whether it's, where it's, the amount of energy it's losing, the color, how much energy it starts with. Again, the only point of this whole slide is the questioning of uniformitarian assumptions. And those assumptions assume that nothing has changed over time. I think we as Christians would argue that things have changed over time, especially from the Earth standpoint of, you know, the flood and catastrophe, right? So evolutionists stand by uniformitarian assumptions that nothing, the processes we see today are consistent and haven't changed over time. But if that's the case, then we should see more consistency in the dating of items. Mark, we can talk about blue stars, and maybe I'm not explaining it well.
No, I think you are. Maybe I'm not doing my best getting the point across.
But
I guess my point is some of these are extremely unfair measurements for trying to measure billions of years.
well, I'm not, and again, I'm saying my point is that we don't know the age. I can't tell the age based on these scientific methods.
And how come there's a zero in the greater than 4 billion column?
I think it's not assuming radiometric dating. It must not be assuming radiometric dating. I actually looked for all the raw data on this. The footnote in the book I read put me to another book, and I don't have that other book. And so I wasn't able to get to all the data. I would like to see all that as well, Mark, but I'm assuming they didn't use radiometric dating, because clearly radiometric dating gets you up to 4.5 billion years.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which one? This is radiometric dating. In the video that we had watched, if you guys remember 2 weeks ago, it had gone through assumptions that scientists use when they do radiometric dating. Again, because we don't know the past, the scientist has to assume initial conditions in the rock sample today are the same as what they were in the past. The amount of, and if you remember the explanation, you have a parent isotope that decays over time, and then it eventually comes to a stable isotope, what they call the daughter element, right? And so the amount of the parent or daughter elements in the sample has not been altered by processes other than the radioactive decay, which means, you know, something hasn't added to the system or taken away from the system other than the decay of the element. And it assumes that the decay rate, which they call the half-life, of the parent isotope has remained constant since the rock was formed. Again, these are assumptions going in, and depending upon what you assume for these, right, you're going to get different different dates. So the evolutionists have assumptions that they use for this based on what we see today, and they use those assumptions for coming up with the 4.5 billion years, which is how they date the age of the Earth, 4.5 billion years. But again, there's inconsistency in this data. If this was scientifically proven and 100% true, then it should be consistent and accurate every single time. But we know things like coal and diamonds and sometimes things trapped in wood, wood that's been trapped in lava, have carbon-14 in them. Now, carbon-14 has a half-life of just 5,000 years, and this is very technical. Well, in theory, if things are billions of years old, you won't see any carbon-14 in something like coal or diamonds. You shouldn't see any carbon-14 in them. But yet, when we have diamonds and we measure carbon in them, we do find carbon-14, which leads you to believe something is wrong in the assumptions. Either the decay rate's different, or something contaminated the sample, or things are younger than they really are. Than we are really told they are. They also find biomaterial in dinosaur fossils. They found soft tissue in dinosaurs. And if dinosaurs are millions and millions of years old, how do we have biomaterial in dinosaur fossils? We also, when we do radiometric dating on rocks of known ages, we get
incorrect results. So these are just a couple of like volcanic eruptions, so we know the age of the rock when it occurred. But when we radiometrically date them, we get these dates out here, which are clearly not the real age of the rock. We also find that there's different ways to radiometric date. You can use different parent-daughter isotopes to do the measurement. And if you use one of those, you might get one age. If you use a different one, you might get a different age. But again, if all these assumptions are true and if the science is proven, you should get the same age each time you do it. And again, I'm not saying that this means the Earth is 6,000 years old. I think by the Bible, it means the Earth is 6,000 years old. Scientifically, what this means is this would tell me that this dating method is not accurate. And it has some suspect assumptions in it.
Yeah, one thing's a little different about the aging of rock is there's the observation of the rock layers and saying it took this long to form it. When you do the radiocarbon dating or radiometric dating, you're assuming that the lava form was different than the rock form, right? So if these formed from lava, but the lava already had a decay process in that. So that one becomes more sketchy for me. The carbon-14 is really quite clear. That's well established in terms of at least you've got a living thing, that thing dies, it doesn't absorb any new carbon, right? So now there's a decay. But in this case, the decay's happening in the lava too.
So when lava is not a rock yet, and I think what this is assuming is once the lava hardens and becomes the rock material, then they can do the dating at that point.
Yeah. Well, but it's essentially the atom that's decaying from one to the next. That can happen in the lava form as well as it can happen in the rock. I think that's the one thing that falls apart. I think these are really interesting when people look at the observable layers and say that takes thousands or millions of years to form. And then you say, well, it's only 40 years old. That's a strong argument to me. But the argument of saying, well, I did radiometric dating and it put it out at 2 million years, but I don't think going from lava to rock changes the isotope behavior of the atom.
I think it does, but let me look into that. I think it's a different composition from when they do, from how they can do the
The
testing.
decay starts happening when it cools
Once the
down.
rock has formed,
Once it's cooled down
Yeah.
from the lava form.
I believe that's the case, and I'll dig into that more.
Okay, that's good, yeah, thanks.
You're giving
I
me a
didn't
bunch
mean
of
to get into
homework.
that.
No, it's good. It's good. We'll flush out the
We like
details.
this class, we want it to go another week. But if I could make one quick comment about the radiometric dating as well, I didn't know a lot about that, so I've read a couple articles. And the potassium argon is one of those really, really long methods, so that's a very long half-life for the potassium to change into argon. And so this is the technique that they use to go billions of years. And so trying to date something that's 20 years old with this technique, it's obviously going to have huge error bars. Because basically, if you just have a small amount of contamination in the sample, which you tested in the same one that the last piece of rock was in, so there's usually a little bit of contamination. Basically, unless it's a really, really, really state-of-the-art facility that has an amazing process to clean their reactor after every sample, they basically say you don't test anything suspected to be less than a couple million years old with this method, because you'll get garbage.
For that particular
And
method.
that's what this looks like. I mean, it's all stuff that's in kind of that garbage range,
Yep.
where if it's under 2 million years, you can't use that method. It's garbage.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I didn't put the slide up here, thought it was getting a little too nerdy, but for all those different methods, they all have different half-lives, and you use them for testing different types of things. Like carbon-14, you can only test something that had living material in it, and it's only good out to 50,000 years before you're going to lose all the carbon. And there's other methods that are more in the millions or hundreds of millions, and then in the billions of years, depending upon the half-life of the parent-daughter relationship there. Yeah.
Again, if the assumptions are correct.
If the assumptions are correct, right. So back to I've shown this slide, I think the very first class. It's all uneven. Anyway, that bothers me. But again, when we look at this and we've looked through the scientific method now, and we look through all of these things had to have happened at some point in the evolutionary process. And I'm not here to try to go through every one of these and how they could have happened, but the scientific method, when we apply it rigorously to all of these, we don't have, nobody has been able to go through and tell us scientifically how these things happen. Yet all of these things have to happen for evolution to be true, to get us to where we are today. So if you remember first class, I went through and did some quick explanations of terms. I had defined creationism, creation, microevolution, natural selection, and what these things are. I did not have this one in here, common descent. For me, common descent was just the idea that we're all from a single organism. We all come from some single organism to the diversity of life today. I include this in this, which is macroevolution, or molecules to man evolution, which is undirected, random mutations of millions of years created life. As I've been reading more and more about this stuff, there are scientists who separate these two things. Because there are scientists who will say, and actually that list of 1,000 scientists would say, Darwinian evolution doesn't explain this. But then they'll be like, well, but this still might be true. We still might come from a common ancestor, we just don't understand exactly how it all happened. And so I just separated them because I see it in the literature as being separate, but to me, these are really one and the same discussion. But what we want to do is let's look at these things and apply the scientific method and see where we get and if we can clearly prove these things. So this is just natural selection, which is really, let me go back. Right, so natural selection is really just, it's the change in an organism over successive generations due to the environment or other external factors that enhance the animal's survival. Right, so this is something that you can prove, you can test. As a creationist, I fully believe this happens. We know this happens. We see this in animals, in the wild. We can make it happen through breeding. This is an example of, I was going to draw this, but we're running out of time, so I won't. If you have two dogs and say they have medium length hair, so this is, the L is for long hair, the S is for short hair. So together you've got a medium length hair dog, and just trust me, this is super, super watered down just to prove a point. But when you breed a a dog with genetics of long and short, you're going to get a dog with, oh, I do want to draw this. I can't explain it. So the way they, and again, very simply, the way they draw this is if you have a long and a short genetically and a long and a short, then the combinations you can get from this genetic makeup is you can get a long-haired dog, you can get medium hair, and a short-haired dog. Right? So these are the different combinations you can get of dog hair length that you can get out of this. Now, if you then take, let's say you breed two dogs that only have genetic material for long hair. So you can see that you're only going to get a long-haired dog if they have no genetic code for short hair. So in this dog, you have a 25% chance of just getting a long-haired dog. You have a 50% chance of getting a medium-haired dog and a 25% chance of getting a short-haired dog. Whereas in this case, you're going to always get a long-haired dog. But what's happened here is through the breeding process, you've changed the dog. The dog is no longer medium hair. The dog is now, the offspring are now all long hairs. The dog has changed. There has been noticeable change. But what you have here is a loss of information. Right? You can no longer get a short-haired dog anymore. So Evolution is going from the less complex to the more complex. You have to actually add information, you have to add genetic material to go from the less complex to the more complex. So the process of natural selection does not do that. It actually, you lose information over time in the process of natural selection. And we know this is shown, so we know that scientifically, this process can't get us to evolution. Okay? So we're kind of running out of time. I'll just keep going on this white screen here. So what can we get from natural selection? Natural selection it does, right? It decreases genetic information. It does allow organisms to survive better in a given environment. If you've got a bunch of dogs that move into a cold environment, those with short hair might die out, the long-haired ones survive, the long-haired ones keep breeding, you end up with a bunch of long-haired dogs in a cold environment. So it does act as a selector, right? But what it doesn't do is it doesn't provide new genetic information. Organisms don't change from dogs to cats, right? They always remain dogs using natural selection. And it doesn't act as what they're saying is as an originator, meaning it's not going to create new genetic information that's going to then create the, some new animal. So that's the first of these listed here. When we look at mechanisms of change in animals, right, we can look at natural selection and say it happens, we can prove it scientifically, but the way it happens is not going to get us to evolution. It's not going to get us to this molecule's demand. Now, what we'll talk about next time then is these next two items, which is, okay, scientifically then, what can I say scientifically about common descent, and what can I say using the scientific method about molecules demand evolution? And can we get to evolution scientifically with these assumptions? Yes, Mark?
I could just quick chime in.
Yes, sir.
So you're absolutely correct. Natural selection does not generate new info. It's the half of the equation that whittles the info down. But of course, the half of the equation that adds the new info, that's the genetic mutation.
It's mutation. Yep. We'll talk about that with you. But I agree.
Because I would just, and again, to kind of take a longer, so we agree that we can get all the dogs we see today from wolves. That happened recently enough. We're all pretty good with that. And yet you see lots of new info there. You don't see a lot of these traits you see in pet dogs out in wolf populations. So we know that new info can and does arise quite frequently.
Okay.
Right.
Well, I guess I'd argue whether that's new info or not. It could always have been, everything you see in a dog today could have already started in the dog from day one. And it's been selected over time. It doesn't mean it's new info. But
I've missed those Chihuahua wolves though.
I do, well, it doesn't mean the genetic material's not, doesn't mean the genetic material's not there.
It could be a regressive gene, right?
It doesn't mean the genetic material's not there, and we'll talk about that.
The Chihuahua wolves didn't survive the natural selection process.
But you're, just for your point, Mark, you're absolutely right. Mutation is the other side of this equation. We will talk about that. I'm starting with natural selection because there's a lot of time what evolutionists will do is they'll say, because natural selection is true, and we can see dogs changing, I can extrapolate that and say, well, if that's true, then clearly other larger scale change can happen. And I just want everybody to understand that the mechanism that happens in natural selection is not a mechanism that can lead to evolution. But mutation, I understand, evolution argument can be. Yeah, Andrew.
This is so, not even about this, but it was about that video. This is just some Lutheran like trivia on the video we watched where they were kind of making fun of the president of Missouri Synod.
Right.
If you look up CFW Walther, he was the ugliest man ever.
It's true.
And that's a real inside joke with Lutherans, so
Yeah.
just look him up.
Very much inside baseball for Luther.
or to long hair, short hair, I mean, there's no genetic material being added. It's just being reorganized
Yeah.
and refined.
And you,
And
yeah.
you're losing
And you're actually losing,
My
you're actually
understanding
losing.
is the scientific community has never proven that mutation is added material.
Yeah.
So-
That's how I see
Well,
it.
we'll talk about, and Mark's gonna probably disagree, but I would agree that, mutation, there is not any evidence that you can have enough beneficial mutation to create what we see today. There's actually a whole book out that just came out recently, that talks about how even when you see mutations happen, you're still, in the end, something beneficial might happen to the organism, but you're still overall losing genetic information in it. Yes?
Just a quick question, what is the evolutionary standpoint for why humans aren't evolving anymore? Like, why there's no superhumans at this point? What would that theory be?
I don't know for certain. My guess would be is that they would say we are constantly evolving,
Okay.
and that the time scales are just so large. We haven't, we're slowly evolving into whatever's next.
Right, so just wait a
Through
million years.
through gradual change,
If
right?
you go into a house that was built 300 years ago, you realize people changed. There were people walking around that were felt
Yeah.
that was very.
Like we're
See,
taller.
I don't know about that,
So
because I
no-
feel like in different cultures, there were tall people back then as well. Like, look at the Roman Empire, and some people say, well, we're smarter now. Well, look at the Roman Empire and their engineering feats and how the pyramids were built. So I don't feel as though humans are changing. I think we're in the image of God, and so we have these skill sets.
I mean, I think
so.
physically, we've certainly changed. Certainly our total amount of knowledge that we have today is more. I mean, just based on what we can do technologically. But that doesn't mean that, I don't believe that man was primitive. I don't believe in this
Right.
primitive man concept that we started off as a bunch of Neanderthals and we become smarter and smarter, right? That is completely anti-biblical. God would have, Adam was a smart human being. Did he know how to build a computer? No. But they knew how to build. They could build, the Tower of Babel, right? They could build that. They could build the Ark. They were smart people for the technology that they had. I think an evolutionist would probably just say we are still evolving, but it happens so slowly that you won't see it in any given generation that people are alive. Anything else? So I was hoping to get through this today at least, so we might need another class. But next time, we'll go through this, and we'll see where we're at.
Actually, if I can give you some homework. And not necessarily for the next.
Yes.
But what would be interesting is, looking at that mutation aspect, from a medical perspective of what medical science is aware of, what percentage of mutations have led to human benefit as opposed to death? My understanding, cancer is a mutation that, so are there examples of genetic mutation that medical science is aware of that has propagated and been beneficial and not led to the destruction of the human body?
Okay, good question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. These are all genetic mutations.
That may have
Still on?
You can, it is still, you can click it off.